March 2, 1943. Dawn breaks over Port Moresby, New Guinea, painting the runway in amber light as mechanics wheel out a B-25 Mitchell bomber that shouldn't exist. 8 forward-firing machine guns bristle from its nose where a transparent bombardier station once lived. 4 more guns jut from blisters along its fuselage. The aircraft squats lower than standard Mitchells, weighed down by ammunition belts thick as pythons coiled throughout its belly. Ground crews whisper the same question. How does something this heavy even fly? Major Paul Pappy, Gunn stands beside the bomber, exhaling smoke from a hand-rolled cigarette. His eyes are bloodshot, his hands stained with hydraulic fluid from 72 hours of modifications his own engineering team called suicidal. Army Air Forces brass labeled his design, aerodynamically compromised. Boeing representatives calculated the nose weight would send the aircraft into an unrecoverable dive during combat maneuvers. Test pilots refused to sign off on the prototype. The Japanese convoy steaming toward La holds 8 transports carrying 7,000 reinforcement troops. Intelligence estimates another 4 destroyers escort the fleet. Allied command needs those ships at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea within 72 hours or the entire New Guinea campaign collapses. Conventional bombing from altitude achieved 12% accuracy against moving vessels. Torpedoes require approaches so slow that enemy gunners track the planes like carnival targets. Gunn crushes the cigarette under his boot. His gunship represents something aviation engineers declared physically impossible. A bomber transformed into a ship killer that attacks at wavetop altitude where evasion becomes meaningless and accuracy becomes absolute. The cockpit crew boards without ceremony. Engines cough then roar. Gunn doesn't watch the takeoff. He's already walking toward the next bomber in line, because one experimental aircraft won't sink 8 ships. What happens in the next 3 days will either validate his obsession or prove the engineers right. The convoy isn't waiting for consensus. 18 months earlier, December 1941, Gunn was supervising civilian aircraft maintenance in Manila when Japanese bombs turned his world to ash and screaming metal. His wife and children evacuated on one of the last ships leaving the Philippines. The vessel never reached Australia. Navy reports listed it as missing, presumed sunk. No survivors located. No wreckage recovered. Gunn stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night. He joined the Army Air Forces with a singular obsession: make Japanese ships burn. But the Pacific Theater exposed a brutal tactical problem that killed more aircrews than enemy fighters. Bombing from altitude against moving vessels meant releasing ordnance thousands of feet above the target, calculating wind speed, ship velocity, and trajectory while anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into steel rain. Bomb patterns scattered across empty ocean. Ships steamed on untouched. Torpedo bombers like the TBF Avenger flew low and slow, presenting their profiles to enemy gunners for fatal seconds. Japanese destroyers mounted 25mm cannons that fired shells the size of fists at a rate of 250 rounds per minute. Aviators called torpedo runs flying coffins. Loss rates exceeded 40% on contested strikes. The mathematics of attrition were unsustainable. Meanwhile, B-25 Mitchell bombers, twin-engine, medium-range aircraft designed for precision bombing, were achieving negligible results against naval targets. The Mitchell carried a bombardier in a transparent nose cone who aimed through a Norden bomb sight, that supposedly revolutionary device that promised to put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Against stationary factories or airfields, the Norden performed adequately. Against destroyers zigzagging at 30 knots, it was theatrical optimism. Gunn saw the Mitchell's potential where others saw limitations. The aircraft possessed speed, range, and structural durability. Its twin Wright R2600 engines generated 1,700 horsepower each. Cruise speed reached 230 miles per hour. Combat radius exceeded 1,350 miles with auxiliary tanks. The airframe could absorb significant battle damage and return home. Everything necessary existed except one element: the ability to kill ships. His proposal was surgical in its simplicity and radical in its execution. Remove the bombardier compartment entirely. Replace the transparent nose cone with solid metal. Mount 8.50 caliber machine guns in the nose, fixed to fire forward along the aircraft's flight path. Add 4 more guns in side blisters, 2 per side, aim to converge at 200 yards ahead of the aircraft. Install a 75mm cannon where visibility permitted. Transform the bomber into a gunship that attacked ships the way a fighter attacked bombers. Head-on, overwhelming, and at point-blank range. Engineers calculated the modifications would shift the aircraft's center of gravity forward beyond safe limits. The nose weight would exceed structural tolerances during high-G maneuvers. Recoil from 12 machine guns firing simultaneously would create vibrations that could crack the airframe. The 75mm cannon's recoil might rip free from its mounting. Gunn's response was to build it anyway and solve problems during flight testing. His superiors called it cowboy engineering. Gunn called it the only option faster than the Japanese. The first prototype flew like a brick wrapped in barbed wire. The nose-heavy configuration required constant trim adjustments. Pilots reported the aircraft wanted to dive during acceleration and pitch upward during deceleration. Control inputs felt mushy, delayed, as if the plane was arguing with every command. Boeing's predictions seemed vindicated. Gunn spent nights in the hangar, adding ballast to the tail section, redistributing ammunition storage, adjusting gun mounting angles. He test-fired the weapons on the ground, watching the airframe shudder but hold. He calculated recoil forces and reinforced mounting points with welded steel plates. When pilots complained about handling characteristics, he flew the aircraft himself, learning its temperament through feel rather than engineering manuals. The breakthrough came during a training run against a decommissioned freighter anchored in Milne Bay. Lieutenant Edward Larner took the prototype gunship down to 50 feet above the waves, approaching the target vessel at 250 miles per hour. At 400 yards he opened fire. The combined weight of fire from 12 machine guns carved a horizontal line across the freighter's superstructure. Metal shredded. Windows exploded. The ship's bridge disintegrated under the sustained barrage. Larner maintained fire until 200 yards, then pulled up sharply, banking away as the freighter's fuel tanks erupted. Observers on nearby PT boats radioed back with disbelief. The attack lasted 9 seconds. The freighter was effectively destroyed. No bombs dropped. No torpedoes launched. Just raw kinetic energy delivered faster than the target could respond. Conventional bombing required the aircraft to overfly the target, releasing ordnance and hoping physics aligned. Gunn's gunship attacked horizontally, keeping the target in gun sights continuously, adjusting fire in real time. Word spread through the 5th Air Force. General George Kenney, a commander unafraid of unorthodox solutions, authorized conversion of 25 B-25s to Gunn's configuration. Mechanics worked around the clock, stripping bombardier stations, installing gun packages, reinforcing airframes. Pilots transitioned from precision bombing to what they called commerce destroying, the art of turning ships into scrap metal through overwhelming firepower. Training revealed the gunship's tactical advantage: psychological shock. Ships had rehearsed responses to dive bombers and torpedo planes. They knew when to maneuver, when gunners should anticipate release points. Gunn's gunships attacked from angles Japanese doctrine hadn't contemplated. The aircraft approached at wavetop altitude where radar struggled to distinguish them from surface clutter. They opened fire at ranges where ship-mounted weapons were still traversing to acquire targets. By the time enemy gunners understood what was happening, the gunship had already delivered 2,000 rounds and was banking away. But training exercises against stationary targets or compliant mock-ups didn't replicate combat. The modified Mitchells remained experimental until proven against an actual enemy fleet defended by fighters, destroyers, and the unpredictable violence of the open ocean. Gunn needed a convoy. The Japanese were about to provide one. Intelligence photographs crossed General Kenney's desk on February 28, 1943. Reconnaissance aircraft operating from Rabaul identified a massive Japanese convoy forming in Simpson Harbor. 8 transport ships, each displacing over 6,000 tons, were loading troops and supplies. 4 destroyers took up escort positions. 2 additional cruisers were steaming north to join the formation. This wasn't a supply run. This was an invasion force. Allied codebreakers confirmed the destination: La on New Guinea's northern coast. 7,000 Japanese troops would reinforce the garrison, transforming La into a fortress that could threaten Port Moresby and cut Allied supply lines. If those transports reached their destination, the entire New Guinea campaign would stall for months. American and Australian infantry would face a grinding attrition battle against fortified positions. Casualties would be catastrophic. Kenney faced impossible mathematics. His heavy bombers couldn't achieve the accuracy needed against moving ships. His torpedo bombers would suffer devastating losses against 4 destroyers and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Fighter escorts could suppress some enemy defenses, but Japanese Zeros flying from Rabaul would contest every mile of the approach. Traditional attack doctrine suggested a multi-day campaign, attrition on both sides, uncertain outcomes. Then Kenney looked at the roster of modified B-25s. 25 gunships stood on various airfields across New Guinea, their crews trained but untested in actual combat. The aircraft were faster than torpedo bombers, more maneuverable than heavy bombers, and carried firepower no Japanese commander had encountered. The risk was absolute. If the modifications failed under combat stress, he'd lose aircraft and crews with nothing to show. If they succeeded, he could destroy an entire convoy in a single coordinated strike. Weather reports predicted cloud cover moving into the Bismarck Sea on March 2. Low visibility would hamper both Japanese fighters and Allied bombers. But it would also allow gunships to approach at wave-top altitude, using clouds as concealment until the final attack run. Kenny authorized the operation. All 25 gunships would participate. Pappy Gunn would fly the lead aircraft. The convoy departed Rabaul on March 1, steaming southwest at 12 knots, maintaining tight formation. Japanese commanders expected air attacks but anticipated conventional bombing and possible torpedo runs. They positioned destroyers to maximize anti-aircraft coverage and requested fighter patrols from Rabaul. Standard defensive doctrine, proven effective against previous Allied strikes. What the Japanese didn't know was that Kenny's tactical approach had transformed. The B-25 gunships wouldn't attack from altitude or with torpedoes. They would attack in coordinated waves at masthead height, overwhelming individual ships with concentrated fire before moving to the next target. Each gunship carried enough ammunition for 3 extended firing runs. The plan called for simultaneous strikes against multiple vessels, denying the convoy any opportunity to coordinate defensive fire. March 2 arrived with heavy weather. Clouds sat at 2,000 feet, visibility less than 2 miles. Perfect conditions. The first wave of gunships took off from Port Moresby at 0715 hours, climbing through the overcast before turning northeast toward the Bismarck Sea. Gunn flew lead, his hands steady on the controls despite the modified bomber's stubborn handling. Behind him, 24 more gunships formed up, their pilots silent, their gunners checking ammunition feeds one final time. Intelligence updates confirmed the convoy's position. 60 miles north of La, still steaming in formation, unaware that 25 experimental aircraft were about to test a doctrine that existed nowhere in any Air Force manual. The gunships descended through cloud cover at 0840 hours, emerging at 500 feet above a gray churning sea. Ahead, through rain and mist, smoke trails marked the convoy's position. Gunn pushed the throttles forward. Attack speed, 260 miles per hour. The first transport never saw them coming. Gunn's gunship broke from the clouds at 200 feet, nose pointed directly at the ship's bridge. At 400 yards he triggered the firing system. 8 nose-mounted machine guns erupted simultaneously, their combined fire rate exceeding 10,000 rounds per minute. Tracers arced across the water, converging on the transport's superstructure in a horizontal stream of destruction. The Japanese transport's bridge disintegrated. Windows shattered. Metal buckled. Personnel fell. Gunn held the trigger down, walking fire across the length of the vessel as his aircraft roared overhead at 260 miles per hour. Side gunners added their own streams of fire, raking the deck, puncturing lifeboats, shredding ventilation systems. The attack lasted 11 seconds. Behind Gunn, 3 more gunships repeated the assault on the same transport. The vessel shuddered, listing to port as fires erupted amidships. Japanese destroyers opened fire too late. Their 25mm cannons tracked targets that had already passed, banking away into cloud cover before defensive fire could adjust. The gunship's speed and altitude made them nearly impossible targets for weapons designed to engage aircraft at higher altitudes or slower speeds. By the time gunners acquired the next gunship in line, it had already delivered its payload and was climbing back into the clouds. The second wave struck 15 minutes later. 6 gunships emerged from different cloud banks, attacking 3 transports simultaneously from multiple angles. The Japanese formation couldn't concentrate defensive fire effectively. Each ship fought its own isolated battle against aircraft that appeared, fired, and vanished within seconds. One transport took hits below the waterline, machine gun fire punching through hull plates, flooding the engine room. The vessel lost power, slowing, becoming an even easier target for follow-up strikes. A Japanese Zero appeared through a gap in the clouds, diving toward a lone gunship that had separated from formation. The B-25's tail gunner spotted the fighter and called out the intercept. The pilot, Lieutenant James Murphy, executed a maneuver that shouldn't have worked in an aircraft carrying 12 tons of ordnance. He rolled the gunship into a hard right turn, bleeding speed deliberately, forcing the Zero to overshoot. As the Japanese fighter flashed past, Murphy's nose guns, still hot from the previous ship attack, fired a 2-second burst. The Zero's wings separated from the fuselage. It tumbled into the sea. Destroyers attempted to form a protective screen around the remaining transports, but their maneuverability meant nothing against aircraft attacking from wave-top altitude. A destroyer's anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough to engage targets skimming 15 feet above the water. When gunships approached from dead ahead, the destroyer's own superstructure blocked its forward guns from bearing on the target. One destroyer commander tried ramming speed, turning bow on toward an approaching gunship, but the B-25 simply banked slightly and raked the destroyer's deck from stem to stern before continuing toward a transport beyond. By 1,000 hours, 4 transports were sinking or dead in the water. 2 destroyers showed heavy damage, one trailing smoke from a fire amidships that its crew couldn't contain. The remaining transports attempted to scatter, breaking formation in a desperate bid to present multiple fleeing targets. Gunn's voice crackled over the radio, calm and methodical. Reform and press home. The gunships regrouped, climbing into cloud cover to assess damage and redistribute remaining ammunition. The third wave came at noon. Fewer gunships participated. Some had expended ammunition, others showed battle damage from near misses by anti-aircraft fire, but their attacks achieved even greater precision. Pilots knew the modified Mitchell's quirks now, understood exactly how much lead to apply at different ranges, recognized when to break off to avoid debris from exploding ships. 2 more transports took catastrophic damage. A destroyer, attempting to shield a transport with its own hull, absorbed so much machine gun fire that its superstructure became unrecognizable twisted metal. Japanese fighters from Rabaul finally arrived in force, but the tactical situation had evolved beyond their ability to influence. The gunships operated in the clouds like submarines beneath waves, emerging only for attack runs, disappearing before fighters could intercept. When Zeros did engage, they found themselves chasing aircraft that refused to dogfight, instead diving for the deck where superior numbers meant nothing and any collision with the ocean was fatal. March 3rd brought clear skies and a final accounting. Allied reconnaissance photographed the destruction. 4 transports capsized, 2 burning hulks barely afloat, 1 destroyer sinking by the bow, another listing severely. Scattered lifeboats dotted the Bismarck Sea, carrying survivors who would never reinforce La. The Japanese convoy had effectively ceased to exist. Follow-up strikes over the next 24 hours finished off crippled vessels attempting to limp back to Rabaul. The final tally exceeded even Kenny's optimistic projections. 12 Japanese ships destroyed or so heavily damaged they were scuttled. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned. Only 850 reached La aboard the 2 transports that escaped. 0 B-25 gunships lost during the initial attacks. 2 damaged by anti-aircraft fire but recovered successfully. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became one of the most lopsided naval engagements of the Pacific War. Gunn's unworkable gunships had achieved what traditional doctrine said was impossible. The strategic consequences rippled across the Pacific theater. Japanese planners abandoned large-scale troop movements by surface convoy in contested waters. The loss of 7,000 reinforcements and 8 transport vessels shifted the balance in New Guinea permanently. Australian and American forces advanced steadily along the northern coast, capturing La by September 1943. The Japanese never attempted another major convoy operation within range of Allied airfields. Gunn's modification package became standard doctrine. By mid-1943, every B-25 unit in the Pacific received gunship conversions or factory-built variants incorporating the design improvements. The aircraft gained official designation as the B-25G and later the B-25H, featuring even heavier armament including 75mm cannons mounted in the nose. Production lines at North American Aviation built 2,500 gunship variants before war's end. Other theaters adapted the concept. In the Mediterranean, B-25 gunships attacked Axis shipping with devastating effectiveness. In the China-Burma-India theater, they supported ground forces by destroying fortified positions and infrastructure. The doctrine of low-altitude, heavy firepower strikes influenced post-war aircraft design, contributing to the development of dedicated ground attack aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt 2 decades later. Pappy Gunn received the Distinguished Service Cross for his innovations in combat leadership. He flew 40 combat missions, personally accounting for multiple ship kills and continuing to refine gunship tactics until the war's end. His personal loss, the family that never returned from Manila, remained unspoken among his crews, but everyone understood that his obsession with destroying Japanese ships carried a weight beyond tactical necessity. The engineers who declared the gunship concept unworkable never issued formal retractions, but their calculations had missed something essential. Innovation under pressure doesn't follow textbook principles. Gunn hadn't solved the aerodynamic problems theoretically. He'd solved them empirically, through trial and error, by flying the aircraft until he understood its temperament. The modifications defied conventional wisdom but worked because someone refused to accept that impossible meant anything permanent. Japanese naval doctrine never adapted effectively to the gunship threat. Their anti-aircraft weapons remained optimized for higher altitude bombers. Training emphasized defense against torpedo attacks and dive bombing. When B-25 gunships appeared at wave-top altitude, defensive doctrine offered no effective response. By the time Japanese commanders understood what they faced, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea had demonstrated that control of the air at low altitude meant control of the seas below. The B-25 gunship's legacy extended beyond simple kill ratios. It proved that aircraft could dominate naval engagements without bombs or torpedoes, using kinetic energy alone. It validated the principle that overwhelming firepower applied with precision could substitute for explosive payload. It showed that tactical flexibility, adapting existing platforms to new roles, could outpace purpose-built designs that took years to develop. Most importantly, it demonstrated that skepticism from experts wasn't proof of impossibility, just evidence that the solution hadn't yet been discovered. Years after the war, aviation historians debated which innovation contributed most decisively to Allied victory in the Pacific. The list included radar, code-breaking, fleet carriers, long-range submarines. Few mentioned the B-25 gunship, despite its outsized impact on Japanese logistics and strategic planning. Perhaps because the innovation seemed too simple, too obvious in retrospect. Perhaps because it originated not from research laboratories or defense contractors but from one grieving engineer who refused to accept limitations. Gunn died in 1957, his civilian life after the war quiet and unremarkable compared to those 72 hours in March 1943 when his modifications destroyed a convoy and changed naval aviation doctrine. He never spoke publicly about his family lost in the Philippines. The connection between personal tragedy and professional obsession remained implicit, understood but unspoken. The last B-25H gunship was retired from military service in 1959, replaced by jet-powered aircraft that could fly faster, higher, and farther. But on March 2, 1943, above the Bismarck Sea, those qualities mattered less than 12 machine guns firing in unison at a range where missing was physically impossible. The engineers who called the design unworkable weren't wrong about the aerodynamics. They were simply asking the wrong question. They calculated whether it could fly safely according to established parameters. Gunn asked whether it could kill ships before those parameters mattered. The difference between those two questions was 12 destroyed vessels in 3 days, and a war that shifted 1 degree closer to ending.